Greetings. This lecture is the decision-making context. Specifically, we're going to be addressing the context within which we tend to make decisions. So we're going to talk about how individual differences, such as our personalities and our experiences, influence the kinds of decisions we make and the way that we frame and see them. We're also going to look at corporate culture, company culture, national culture, and also address organizational structure. And as you know from your reading, we design the structure around the decisions we need to make. So we'll be covering quite a bit of material in this one lecture, but all with respect to what are the things that influence the way we make decisions. As you'll read in your book, the way that we perceive our environment, the process by which we take in information and organize it and ultimately make a judgment on what it is that we're seeing is really dependent on a large process that has lots of feedback loops. For example, something grabs our attention, whatever it is, something that's moving fast, something that's moving slow, something that's out of the ordinary or novel, and then we try to organize what we're seeing and try to understand it. We put an interpretation on it based on our past experiences and based on the way that it fits in within the structure of our own experiences. We retrieve that information, we plug it in to, a place in our brain that's sort of a placeholder that really helps to give us some understanding of what we're looking at, and then we make a judgment on the thing that we're observing, whether we think it's good or bad, or we're indifferent, or it's something that we need to act on, or it's something that we need to ignore. But whatever the judgment is, we make it. But this is an ongoing feedback process, and every single time we retrieve something, and it might be new or novel or different, we might change what brings things to our attention, we might change how we organize it, we might change in how we interpret it, etc., etc. So the whole point here is that once we get a stimulus of some sort, whatever that is, our brain and our past experiences and our personality and things like this influence how we ultimately judge what it is that we're seeing and then make a decision on how to act upon it. So as you can see from this next slide on the things that influence perception, there's three major categories. One is the characteristics of the perceiver, and as I've already mentioned, our individual differences and our experiences will frame the way that we see things. So we don't just perceive things in a vacuum, it's usually perceived within the lens of who we are, what our personality is like, what our values are, and what experiences we've had in the past that may influence that. Then there's the stimulus itself that influences us, and that's certainly the thing that may get our attention in the beginning of the process. Something that is more intense in sound or color or whatever, or sensation, whatever that might be. Things that are in contrast are more likely to get our attention than things that are the same. So if we see something that is contrasting and a little bit different, that's the thing that gets our attention. The more that we frequently repeat something, the more it sticks in our head. So, the old commercial, head on, put it directly on your forehead, and they repeat this multiple times in the commercial, and you're annoyed by it, but it made you remember it. Whether or not you actually want to use the product is a separate issue, but you do remember the commercial. You do remember it because we know that, the more that we repeat something, the more it's likely to stick in. So if you listen to commercial radio, it's the same sort of thing. We hear the same songs over and over and over again because the more frequently people hear it, the more likely they are to recall it, to want to buy it, to say that they like the song. And that's, of course, what all the radio and record companies are interested in, is having us buy their records and CDs or digital songs, MP3s, however the format is these days. They want us to buy their music, no matter how we slice it. Things that are novel, things that are different, that we've never experienced before. Something brand new and exciting is going to get our attention. Something that is larger is much more likely to get our attention than something that is smaller. And then something that is in motion is more likely to get our attention than something that is at rest. Lastly, the characteristics of the situation, either the primacy of the experience, the recency of the experience, or the scripts and schemas we develop around certain experiences influence how we perceive things. And so when we talk about primacy, imagine that you walk into your organization the first day at work and you meet somebody who you really like, and so your impression of them and perhaps even your impression of the organization from day one sticks with you, that this is a nice place to work and I really like these people. A year later, that primacy effect, that initial experience you had, sticks with you, and you remember, wow, that was really awesome, and even though there's been some ups and downs, I still really like this place. The recency effect is basically the same idea, but it's where the more recent experience is what influences. So if, let's say you had sort of mediocre entry into your new organization, and then towards the end of your first year there, something really, really bad happened, and then you kind of look back and you think, well, it was okay, but man, this last thing is the thing that really sticks with me. And that recency effect is the thing that might persuade you to either stay with the organization or perhaps to leave. So that recency is always a challenge there. Lastly, we have the schemas. And what a schema is the way that our brain organizes things and to put it into some sort of order so we can make sense of it. And so a typical schema is our morning routine. We get out of bed, we check our phones, we go to the bathroom, we brush our teeth, we take our shower, we go out, we put the coffee on, we drink our coffee, we eat our Rice Krispies, we walk out the door after we pet the dog on the head, and we hop in our car and we take the same route to work every day. And I'm sure we've all had these days, and I know I have as well, where you're so tired or you've been so busy that suddenly you are aware that you got to work and you don't remember the trip in. And that's because we're engaged in a schema. We know where we need to be, when we need to be there, and we just follow the same pattern of behaviors over and over again. And schemas are a really easy way for us to repeat behaviors without having to put a lot of conscious effort into it. It's kind of like building a habit, for all intents and purposes. By now, you should have reviewed the optical illusions that were linked in the Blackboard folder for the class. And those are great examples of how the perceptual process can play tricks on us and have us assume that we've seen something or perceived something in a certain way when in fact we didn't. And this leads us into this discussion about perceptual distortions. Perceptual distortions are an important part of these optical illusions. They are the way that our brain sees things and interprets things in a very different way than perhaps might be intended. So there's lots of different ways that we can experience decision-making biases, and these perceptual distortions or decision-making biases are an example of the things that our brain does very naturally in terms of trying to simplify and make sense of their environment. And I'm not to sit here and say that I think item number 2 on the list, the simplifications and stereotypes, are a good thing. I actually don't believe that at all. But it is a natural thing that our brain does. And so because we are conscious, cognizant, responsible, mindful adults, there's no reason why we can't look at those stereotypes and oversimplifications and recognize that's exactly what they are and not act on them, or work hard to not act on them, as we may see. The different distortions up there, we're going to get into a lot more detail when we talk about decision-making biases in the next lecture, but, for example, selective attention. Because we get distracted by things that are novel, or fast, or tall, or brightly colored, intense in sound, that's the stuff that gets our attention first. So the loudest person always gets attention. The introvert doesn't always get the same attention because they're not as loud and assertive as someone who might be an extrovert. So that's one example. Simplifications and stereotypes I've already talked about. Our brain wants to simplify and try to understand things. Doesn't mean that these simplifications and stereotypes are good, but it is a natural process that our brain undergoes that we have the capabilities of overcoming. Halo and horn bias. Halo bias is where one thing is positive, therefore we believe all things are positive about an individual or a situation. The same thing with a horn bias. One thing bad, we assume everything is bad about an individual or a situation. Contrast bias, where it's very difficult to, it's very natural for us to compare two things or two individuals, for example, one who comes after the other, and contrast them against each other as opposed to against a standard for which we need to judge them. And so we might see this, in the selection process when we need to make a hiring decision. We might see a candidate who is really not very good at all, and the next candidate comes in, and they seem like they're amazingly great, and they should be their heads above the person before them, but it doesn't mean that they were all that good. It might mean that they just are better than the person that was behind them. So we have to be really careful of not allowing ourselves to get caught in that contrast bias and either having a very positive or very negative reaction to someone. Our goal is to try to judge them against a set of organized and structured criteria. Confirmation bias is where we are only looking for information that confirms what we already believe, as opposed to looking for the disconfirming evidence. And this becomes a big issue when we're looking at the context of making decisions under uncertainty and an ambiguity. It is really easy for us to only look for confirming information, and it's when we only look for the confirming information that we get broadsided by an anomalous event or something that's uncertain. And so we have to be very mindful to avoid the confirmation bias. Ease of recall is anything that's really easy for us to recall, something that's more present, more recent, is something that's going to stick in our head. So we want to, again, be careful of this ease of recall thing. And then anchoring bias, where we get anchored to thinking about things in a certain way, and then it's hard for us to break free of that anchor. People kind of set the anchor and decide, this is the baseline from which you try to judge something, when in fact that anchor or that baseline may be inappropriate. Two examples of these kind of things are self-serving biases or fundamental attribution errors. Individuals have a very high self-perception, and so we tend to make self-serving bias decisions where we might say, I did not do well on that assignment because it was really hard and because somebody interfered with my ability to do it. It was everybody else's fault. It wasn't my fault. When in fact it could very well be your fault. We tend to err on the side of finding reasons and excuses to justify why we may not have been very successful, or why we may have been successful at something when we really didn't deserve it. A fundamental attribution error is where, for example, your boss may look at you and you weren't successful on something mostly because you didn't have resources or money or their support, and they'll say, well, you failed, it's all your fault. And they're making an attribution that you are the one that caused it, when in fact maybe they didn't give you the resources, or maybe they didn't support you the way they should. That's a very common attribution error, where we assume that the person is guilty of something when in fact they had no control over the outcomes that they are now experiencing. As I said earlier, individual differences have a huge impact on the way that we perceive things. And here are some examples of the kinds of things that make up individual differences. Our abilities, whether they are physical or cognitive abilities, but our abilities differ from person to person. And so because they differ from person to person, each one of us has an individualized, unique mix of abilities and personalities, attitudes and values and learning styles that influence the way that we perceive things. So personality, also important. Attitudes about things, our attitudes about work, our attitudes about our surroundings, that influences us, what our values are. And certainly the way that we take in and learn things also is going to influence how we perceive the world. So as I said, our abilities, our cognitive, our physical, or our psychomotor abilities are the things that influence the way that we perceive things. And in fact, psychomotor abilities is about how we assess a situation and then we react physically to what we are assessing. So it's kind of a combination of both the cognitive ability to perceive things and the physical ability to be able to manage our body and to react to things appropriately. You might see a psychomotor ability test for a police officer as they are assessing whether or not a perpetrator may be at risk. We're at risk because of a perpetrator, or whether it might be an innocent person there. So part of the simulations that police officers go through is having to assess a scenario and determine whether or not there's a risk or whether or not they shouldn't be able to move on. And so our abilities, the more we're able to entrust in our physical abilities, the more apt we are to perceive something to be safe or not safe. And the same thing with our cognitive abilities. The stronger our cognitive abilities to assess a situation, the more confident we become in our ability to perceive something and to adapt and to move on. And obviously the combination of the two would work really well together. But when I don't feel very strong physically or even cognitively, I don't trust my own judgment. I don't trust what I'm seeing. I don't trust what I'm perceiving and how and why I'm perceiving it. So it may be more challenging for me then to act. So our individual abilities clearly influence the extent to which we perceive something and how the label that we put on it. There are all sorts of different types of personality measures, and the most common one is the big five personality measure: extroversion, conscientiousness, agreeableness, emotional stability, and openness to experience. Those plus signs and those minus signs are relative to the impact these things have on our ability to perform a job. And actually the negative with agreeableness means that it really doesn't have any impact on our ability to perform well or to perceive things in the organization or perceive anything anywhere. Extroversion will certainly influence the way that we perceive things and the attributions we make. Our conscientiousness will do that. Our emotional stability, how calm we are, how level-headed we feel, and how open we are to new things. And so all of these characteristics, and less so agreeableness, but certainly the other ones, really do influence the way that we perceive things. Other aspects that influence us are locus of control, where we believe either that we can control our own destiny or our destiny is at the mercy of external factors. Authoritarianism is, how comfortable you feel giving deference to authority and being obedient to power differences in society. And we'll talk about that in the context of national culture in a little bit, but authoritarianism isn't just something that's unique to the U.S., but it differs across national cultures. Self-monitoring, it's where we are able to understand ourselves and to understand our situation and present an image that we think will be consistent with what is needed to happen within a particular given situation. High self-monitors are really, really sensitive to their environment, and they will adapt accordingly. Low self-monitors just don't care. They are very happy with being very consistent in their personality and who they are, and they don't worry about adapting to the context. And this has some pros and cons. And obviously this class is not a class on personality measures and characteristics, but it is interesting, when you think about, high versus low self-monitors. Low self-monitors, while it may seem good that they feel more authentic and comfortable with themselves, that may put them at a disadvantage that they don't come across as being very politically savvy when they need to be. Approval motivation is, how much we need, approval from others in a socially desirable way. And then achievement motivation is basically how important it is for us to achieve or to be able to personally achieve something. Attitudes are another aspect that influences our perceptions. And sometimes our perceptions influence our attitudes and vice versa, but clearly our attitudes about things then cloud the way that we might continue to see the world. And that's just a great example of that wonderful feedback loop we talked about. As we perceive things and as our attitudes change, that then changes the way we might perceive things in the future. It's an interesting loop. What is an attitude? Basically, it's a combination of cognition, basically how I think about things, affect, how I feel about things, and ultimately behavior, how I actually behave. So my attitude is a combination of all three of those things. When those things were out of whack, we might call that cognitive dissonance, because what I see is one thing, but what I'm behaving in a way that's very contrary to what I'm believing or what I'm feeling. And so cognitive dissonance is something that can be really frustrating. Attitudes can change, certainly at an individual level and perhaps even at an organizational level. And I'd like to consider that organizational level attitudes are really an example of corporate culture. And corporate culture can change. It just changes over a very, very long time frame. Individual attitudes can change as well. Perhaps it doesn't take quite so long to change as it would take organizational culture, but nonetheless, individual attitudes can change, but it takes a lot to change someone's cognition and affect and ultimately their behaviors. It sort of has to go kind of in that sequential order. It's really hard to change a behavior if someone doesn't think and feel that it's the right thing to do. Other attitudes besides cognitive dissonance that are important are things like satisfaction, job satisfaction, workplace satisfaction, things like that. And then commitment. I have an attitude about how committed I feel to my company. And commitment has three basic dimensions. There's normative, affective, and continuance commitment. And normative commitment is, the norms of my company, what I'm supposed to do. Because that's what the norm is. I mean, we're supposed to do things in a certain way for a certain time frame, etc. Affective commitment is what I want to do. And so it's my commitment to do things because I want to do it, not because I have to, because it's the norm, but because I have a strong affinity and a desire to behave in a certain way or have a certain attitude. And so that affinity, that affective commitment is what is because I want to more than anything else. Continuance commitment is because I need to do it, not because I want to or not because I should, but because I have no choice. I need to do this because I don't have any other options. So I'm doing it because I need to do it, not because I have to or want to necessarily. These attitudes can have enormous impacts on workplace behaviors. And so we have to be really careful as we see people engage in certain attitudes, start to recognize that we should be looking for certain outcomes and certain behaviors that are of note. If someone is really unhappy and they're demonstrating a really bad attitude about things, we might find that they're engaging in counterproductive work behavior, alcohol, drug abuse, workplace theft. And it might be because they don't think things are fair, or things are frustrated, or they're very unhappy either in their work life or their personal life, or both. Other things, bad attitudes can influence workplace violence. The idea of someone going postal because they're unhappy with a situation within the workplace environment. We can have people engage in withdrawal behaviors, either psychologically, where they show up for work but they're not really there. They're busy, tweeting or surfing the web and listening to YouTube videos or playing on Facebook. Or they can have physical withdrawal behaviors where they just show up late or they don't show up at all, they're absent more often than not. Lastly, because we don't want to just think about the negative behaviors, we also want to think about positive behaviors. Good attitudes can influence organizational citizenship behaviors, meaning people will go above and beyond the call of duty because they feel like they need to be a good citizen. So they will work hard when called upon. They will go the extra mile when they need to. And so good attitudes will influence those citizenship behaviors in a positive way. The next aspect of individual differences is our values. And each of us have very, very different values. It could come from our religious upbringing or where we grew up in the country, what our parents and grandparents and families said were important values, or whether you grow up in the city versus the country. There's all sorts of different experiences that help frame our values. Values are fairly stable. They may tweak slightly as we become more mature and we grow and we learn new things, but by and large, our core values tend to be fairly stable. And they are a reflection of what we consider to be very important, and because we consider them to be important, we will behave in a way, we hope, that is very consistent with those values. And as we talk about ethics in this class, you'll see how that comes to play. If we have certain values around the idea of virtue, or the idea of social justice, or the idea of doing what's best for everybody. Those sorts of values influence the ethical lens that we use in seeing the world. And so our ethical lens is just one way to perceive an ethical dilemma. Values tend to break down into two basic categories. One is a terminal value versus an instrumental value. A terminal value is the thing that we value, the end in and of itself. We value happiness or equality or freedom, etc., on that list. An instrumental value is the thing that gets us to the end result, whatever that end result is. We need courageousness in order to engage in equality. We need respect in order to have social respect. We need self-reliance in order to experience freedom. So you can see how these values may work in conjunction with each other. You need an instrumental value in order to drive that terminal value. So a lot of times those instrumental values are the things that bring us to the terminal value that we want to ultimately have access to. And as we already discussed, values will influence how we interact with people, whether or not it will result in conflict. And certainly you can go back to the Jonathan Haidt video that we saw the first week, where we looked at how people have very different values about what they think the political process should look like, for example. And because we have such clear differences on what we value and how that influences even the political parties that we join, that can create more conflict. And the more that we can recognize that other values are legitimate and are important and have value, if you will, then the easier it is for us to deal with these interpersonal differences and minimize the conflict that we experience. Obviously, also, the things that we value will influence the way that we make decisions. If I value a certain thing, I'm going to make a decision in favor of that. And if I don't value something, I will ignore it or even avoid that particular event or issue or concern. And as I already said, the ethics and corporate social responsibility, those are key values. And each lens that we have, each way that we sort of experience our own ethical values, influences the ethical decisions that we make. Lastly, how we learn, the way that we take in information is going to influence the way that we perceive the world. And we know that learning styles are absolutely linked to personality characteristics and ability characteristics. We each have an aptitude or a natural ability to learn, but we all take in information in very different ways. Some people are more visual, some people are more auditory, where they like to close their eyes and just listen. Some people are more read-write, some people are more kinesthetic. And for me, I'm much more auditory, read-write, and kinesthetic, and I'm very low on the visual. Visuals don't usually grab my attention. I really have to focus on something. And a lot of times visuals will distract me from being able to really comprehend what I'm listening to. So many times when I was a student, I would close my eyes and just listen to the professor, because sometimes it was the only way to really absorb what they were talking about. And while that may have looked, perhaps disrespectful, it was just a really unique way for me to get the most out of the lecture and most of out of what I was listening to. The VarkLearn link there, which in this video lecture you're not going to be able to actually click on it, but feel free to copy that web address down, www.vark-learn.com, and you can go to the website and it will help assess what your learning style is. So if you have any curiosity around that, by all means help yourself. It's a very short and easy instrument that can help you to get a good strong sense about your learning style, and in turn will influence the way that you perceive information, the way it's coming into you. Along with individual differences, organizational culture really has a huge impact on the way that we make decisions and the expectations and the norms around the way one should make decisions or what outcomes one would expect to see given a certain decision. And that's, in essence, culture is the way that we frame and organize our attitudes and values and expectations that are shared among all members of an organization. So in essence, it's taking the individual differences and it's looking at what we share in common in terms of our attitudes, values, and behaviors. Culture comes in a couple of different layers. It can be visible and conscious, where we look at artifacts and layouts and symbols and slogans. It can be invisible but conscious, where it's an expressed idea, and then we know that this expressed idea is very consistent with the values of the company. Or it can be these underlying assumptions that we don't even think about. We just seem to know that this is the right way things are and the way things are going to be, and it's not something anybody has ever put words to or cognition to, but we all know there's no way it would be any different than the way it is now. It has to be this way in order for it to be part of this organizational culture. Culture is created really in an ongoing way. Every new person that enters the company certainly influences the culture and tweaks it in a little way so that it changes very incrementally, but nonetheless it does change. And unless there's a radical intervention, culture doesn't change with any kind of speed. It's usually very slow, glacial process, if you will. But the initial company culture and the way it's established usually comes from a number of different sources. Number one, from the company founders. I mean, if you look at Southwest Airlines and Herb Kelleher, you look at Steve Jobs and Apple Computers, these maverick leaders or heroes, whatever we want to call them, determined what they thought the company culture should be, the way they thought things needed to be done. And so they started inculcating those values and behaviors into the people that worked in that company. And so that became something that became taken for granted, and it's just what people do. We also can develop our culture based on what's going on in our external environment. And if we come about in an environment where it's been really volatile, we may become very good at adapting to volatile circumstances. You know, if the company came into fruition in a very stable environment, that's going to influence our culture as well, and may give us some troubles when the environment is not so stable. And so we're very much influenced by what goes on in the real world, whether there are ethical violations or ethical lapses, or whether there are, political and historical trends going on out there that really have an impact on, global culture and individuals. These things, affect us. Certainly, we can look at Enron and what happened with Enron and how that influences every corporate culture now in terms of being very mindful of ethics violations. I mean, that's where Sarbanes-Oxley came out of. So now not only has it changed legislation, but that legislation has also changed corporate cultures in the way that they think about ethics and whistleblowing and things like that. Any contact with others inside the organization, the way people interact also will tweak and adjust and adapt the culture every so slightly. But as I said, it's not something that changes overnight. It takes a really long time for culture to change. What role, then, does culture play in this whole process? Well, culture gives the company their identity. It gives them a sense of who they are, what they stand for, what they're all about. Just as our attitudes and values give us an identity, corporate culture gives the company its identity. It helps us to know what the company culture is because it keeps us in alignment with the organization's mission. Or certainly that's the goal of the corporate culture, is to keep us in alignment with the organization's mission. But ultimately what the culture does is it tells us this is what you can do, this is why you should do it, and here are the repercussions if you don't and the rewards if you do. Stay consistent with the company culture and its expectations and around behaviors. Each company has a unique culture, so where does that uniqueness come from and how can we interpret what it is that we're seeing? Recognize, first of all, that there's not any one single culture in the company. I mean, there may be some broad strokes. These are our consistencies, but we might also see actually very little subcultures and some cultures that may be more dominant than others around things. But these multiple cultures develop across departments, across projects. This group has a culture because they are in St. Louis versus the group that's over in Washington State versus the one that's in Southern California. Each division, department, branch, all experiences different cultures and subcultures. There may be some consistencies, and there should be consistencies across all of those companies, but the bottom line is they will never be completely identical because each culture is influenced not just by the people, but also, which will be different in and of itself, but also by the surroundings within which they're working. And so if you're working in a surroundings in St. Louis, it's very different than the Northwest and very different than Southern California culture, as we've talked about. And as I said, culture will change over time. It's just at a very glacial, incremental pace. And it's also really important to know that cultures don't have a value in and of themselves as being good or bad. They're just different. Short of a company culture that pretty much says, you can lie, cheat, and steal, and that's okay. Not so much, obviously, because not only does it violate the law, but it violates a lot of ethical norms. But nonetheless, as a rule, cultures aren't good or bad. They're just different. There may be dimensions of the culture that may be challenging, or individuals who might express that culture in unique ways, but nonetheless, cultures as a rule don't have a value judgment. It's how people tend to manifest them and how they behave around them that makes the difference. Because culture influences individual core values and corporate core values, how do we see that manifesting itself in the organization? Number one, we might see it in the form of a greater sensitivity to the needs of customers and employees. And Southwest Airlines is a great example of a company that says, when our employees are happy, our customers are happy. And I know we've already talked about that in class. We may also see it influencing the way that we gather information from our employees and how open we are to allowing them the autonomy to generate new and exciting ideas. The more open we are to those ideas, the more open the culture is. Culture influences risk. Some cultures are more prone to risk, some cultures are less prone to risk. It may depend on the industry, it may depend on the individuals running the company, it may depend on the national culture in which the company exists and functions. Some of the national cultures are more risk-taking than others. Middle Eastern culture tends to not be very risky, whereas U.S. culture tends more towards risk. Not only does culture reflect how sensitive we may be to the needs of our customers and employees, but also the value that we place on them. If we really truly value our employees, then we'll engage in certain behaviors. And if we don't value them and we think of them as just commodities that can be thrown away, it's a totally separate animal. How open the communication is a great example of culture. What you can and cannot say, what is allowed to be communicated and what is supposed to not be talked about. And then, again, how friendly and congenial people are towards each other. All of these factors are just great examples of how culture manifests itself. The double S cube of culture gets at two key dimensions for corporate cultures. One is the degree of sociability, which means how friendly or connected people feel to other members of the corporation or the organization. And then the solidarity, which means sort of how well do they work together towards the common goal. It doesn't mean that they have to like each other, and they're not necessarily sociable to have solidarity. Solidarity is really, do we all agree to the goals and work towards the goals? Sociability is about the degree to which we actually get along and we like each other's company. And there's a 2x2 matrix, which we'll see on the next slide, that addresses how those things work. In a culture that is high in sociability, meaning people get along, they enjoy each other's company, and they're high in solidarity, meaning they have very clear ideas of what the goals are, and they're all working together in a unified way towards those goals. That's what we would call a communal culture, where they get along really well, they like each other, and they all can work together interdependently towards the company goals. When there's high sociability, but not a lot of solidarity, they're not always necessarily working towards the same goals, but they like each other. We see that sort of thing in a networked culture, where, I do my thing, you do your thing, and all our things combined will help the organization move forward, but we like each other, so that we don't have debates and fights over things. We just are working at different paces and towards different goals that will communally bring the organization forward, or collectively would probably be a better word. It collectively brings the organization forward. When there's high solidarity, meaning we, again, are all working towards the same goal, but we don't always necessarily like each other. We call that a mercenary culture. And again, it's not necessarily a bad thing. It's simply just saying that, you know, we don't have to like each other and be friendly. We're worker bees, and we put our nose down and we get our job done. We all work like a machine, a well-oiled machine towards the company goal, but it doesn't mean we like each other and hang out and enjoy each other's company. In the circumstances where we have very low sociability, meaning we don't get along very well, and we're not all working towards good interdependent goals, it's a fragmented culture, which means there are people doing all sorts of things in all different ways, and there's very little that's bringing us together, if you will. And that, I wouldn't necessarily call that a bad culture, but it certainly can be a dysfunctional culture. It's not bad, it just has its challenges. And it might work in some contexts, although I haven't to date been able to think of a context within which a fragmented culture would seem to work best, but maybe you guys can come up with some ideas on that. One interesting and generic way we can describe cultures besides this double S cube of culture would be around 4 basic terms: either a baseball team culture, a club culture, an academy culture, or a culture that's basically trying to survive. They're like in survival mode. And in those cultures, all 4 of those cultures, the struggle, of course, is, you know, how do we achieve success within the context of that culture? Which culture is more conducive in which environments? And a baseball team culture is typically associated with things like software development and stuff like that, where it's a very high-risk, high fast-pacing environment. There are high flyers, just like free agents in the baseball team, where, you know, everybody's really good. They're good utility players, and then you've got these free agents who are just amazing athletes, and they're the ones that all the teams fight over. In the software development industry, and in, you know, during the dot-com, growth era, people could move from company to company if they had, even a pulse with really decent skills. They were highly sought after, and so they could move from company to company very quickly, and they could make top dollars and rise up very fast. And that's like a baseball team, right? It all sort of rotates around the stars. A club culture is more about the stability of an old sort of bureaucratic company where it's in a very stable and secure environment, and there's not a lot of upheavals, and there's a very predictable way that we do things. We promote from within, we like our own, and we pat our own on the back. And this can be good to an extent, but the big challenge we have with club cultures is that they could get very stagnant very quickly, and the loyalty, while a good thing, may end up in things like groupthink. And when the environment is not stable, these club cultures really struggle the most. When it's a stable environment, it works perfectly fine. But I'm not sure that there are any inherently stable environments anymore, given the global economy. Everything seems to be shifting. The last 2 cultures, as I said, one is the academy culture, the other one is the fortress culture. I'll skip to the fortress culture because it's really the easiest one to kind of explain. The fortress culture is the company that's in survival mode. They have to really turn in on themselves, try to fix their problems internally before they can start to think about competing, stabilizing, and growing. When you think about a company that's really on the verge of bankruptcy or on the verge of disappearing, they have to kind of change their culture very radically and make changes that are going to systematically change the essence of the company. So a fortress culture is really in danger of failing. And they have to create this fortress, if you will, in order to allow themselves to survive. They can't deal with other stuff till they get, their home fires all in order. And once that's in order, they can start to then grow and think about how they want to rebuild their culture to be much more functional and growth-oriented. The academy culture is kind of like the club culture, but what we might find in some companies is that it's not one uniform club culture, that there may be what we call these individualized cultures, and we call them the academy cultures, because if you look at GM, for example, depending on whether you are a Chevy person or whether you like Buick or whether you like GMC trucks, They're different car companies, all under the GM umbrella. But interestingly, the culture for each one of those is very unique. At one point in time, GM owned Saab, and GM also owned Saturn. Saturn now has long since disappeared. But the Academy culture, you can see in that example how the people who work for Saab and for Saturn were different than the people who work for Chevy. It's just really unique with different cultures. I mean, people didn't really move from culture to culture. Once you establish yourself with one sort of division of the company and one way of doing things, you didn't really mix with the other departments. So there wasn't a lot of interdepartmental or cross-division communication and influence. You know, you pretty much stayed in your little bubble in your one division and you didn't really interact with others. So that's how those four basic categories work. Again, the baseball team, club, academy, and fortress cultures all are sort of unique ways. And I'm sure that there's more ways of defining corporate cultures. These are great examples of some of the major ones, but there are other ways of thinking about culture, and as our environments change and as the world changes around us and we explore new ideas and new ways of being, we'll see more sort of prototypes of what cultures should be. Companies use a number of different tools to facilitate and transmit culture. We talked a few moments ago about how can we perceive what a culture is by looking at how they treat their employees and their customers and those sorts of things. But what are the mechanisms that we use in order to get to that place? First of all, companies use symbols, like objects or acts or events that have meaning. And so there may be symbols like our logo. That is a great example of what our values are, or slogans that we might use. Stories are the narratives. It's not just a slogan, but it's a larger, more detailed narrative about the way that the company was founded and what it means. We know the story of, HP. We know the story of 3M. We know the story of Apple and IBM and AT&T and all these major corporations, even Southwest Airlines. They all have stories about what they are about, how they were founded, and how these stories reflect their key values. For years, IBM had a reputation of not laying people off, and that was part of their story and part of their narrative, and that was part of their culture. And then they got to a point where they became so big and so heavy and so inflexible that they had to change their story. They became, that fortress culture that I mentioned before. They turned in on themselves. They made changes to their culture. They had to get rid of that old narrative and develop a new narrative about who they were and what they stood for. Some of the values stayed the same, but Lou Gerstner, when he stepped in there in the late 80s and early 90s, realized that he needed to make some massive changes. And so what he did was get rid of the narrative that no one would ever lose their job, that no one would ever get laid off. He said that has to change because it would be great if we could keep everybody employed for life, but the economy doesn't allow that anymore. The world economy doesn't allow that anymore. Heroes, I know as I've already talked about, are people or figures who represent key aspects of the company culture, and heroes are Steve Jobs and Herb Kelleher and Ben and Jerry. These guys are heroes because they really exemplify what the culture is for the company. Other things that we use for transmitting culture are rites of passage, where we move from one status to another, and there are great examples of rites of passage when we become an officer in a bank, or when we get tenure in a university, or when we move from, being on probation to being a full-blown employee with all the benefits, right? So there's this transition, and this transition from sort of, moderately unimportant to important to having more status in this new role. There's a rite of passage there, and it feels good, and we honor those rites of passages. The rite of enhancement is where we see the social identity or the status of employees changes. And so as our social identities and the right of enhancement and the way that we see our employees changes, and we give them some value. So we might honor them at the end of the year with a company Christmas party and awards and gifts and bonuses, because we're excited about what they've done for us, and we want to we like to honor them in that way, and what their identity is. A right of renewal is where we are going through some changes, and we want to kind of look back on what are the things that really hold us together, what are the things that are part of our core values. So when we're in this state of flux, it's very important that you make sure you're really clear about, no matter what these changes are that are going on around us, we have some core values that we need to be sticking with, and so we try to use our social structures and kind of the processes we use to institute change and the narrative that we have around change to really make sure people are clear that this is what our culture is, this is what's important, and sort of renewing our values around that. Then the right of integration is the things that we do to kind of bind people together, and a right of integration might be the company picnic, or it might be the bowling league that happens on Friday nights. The goal here is that we want to simply find ways to get people to feel connected to each other, and this is really important if you think about it in a high sociability corporate culture, right? Maybe not so much in a culture that's more mercenary or fragmented, but in cultures where sociability is really important, these rights of integration are the ways that we keep people connected to each other, even if we're busy and going about our own way. But that company picnic and those sorts of things really make a difference in the way that we address and connecting ourselves to others. Culture has to be taken into consideration when we are developing or changing our corporate strategies. And this 2x2 matrix, I think, does a really great job of discussing how we have to marry these two ideas together. For example, let's go to the lower left-hand corner, few changes and low compatibility. If we have very few changes that we're making to our culture, to our strategy, so there's just a few minor things that we're doing, and it's not very compatible with our corporate culture, we sort of downplay the culture. We don't really use the culture to help us institute the change. We simply downplay it and really focus on perhaps the novelty of the new idea or what the new opportunity will give us by making these changes to our strategy. But we really don't want to use the culture in this circumstance because it may come back to bite us. It may have a counter effect where someone will say, well, this is not consistent with our culture, and thus they may start to resist those changes no matter how few that they are. If you have a very few changes and you have high compatibility, if you move over to the right from there, it tends to have more of you want to use a more synergistic focus. It tends to work hand in hand so that we have a few changes, but if it's really compatible with our culture, use the culture to reinforce why the change is good. You can say our company culture has always been about helping people, so this is what we're doing. We're doing this to help people, to help our customers, to help our employees. So you want to use the culture to your advantage in that circumstance. As we move up to the many changes, high compatibility, this is a challenging point, but not incredibly difficult when it's consistent with our corporate culture. People don't like to be changed. People don't like change, and they don't like to be changed. But when we can demonstrate that it is consistent with our norms and our values and our mission, it makes it easier for people to swallow. They may have some beginning residual challenges with those changes, but ultimately, the more that we use our culture and the symbols and the stories and the rites of passage and enhancement, the better off we are. That will make those changes much easier. Lastly, when we have to make a lot of changes to our culture, or a lot of changes to our strategy, and they are not very compatible with our culture, this is the tough point. This is the hardest place. We have a lot that we need to do, and we need to completely turn our company on its head and change the way that we do things. ultimately you have two choices. You either can decide to throw away the strategy because it is so inconsistent with the way that our culture is that it's not going to work. And that may be one approach. I like the second approach, though, and this was the approach that Lou Gerstner took when he took over IBM and said, you know, we've got to change. We've got to decouple from that old narrative and find a new way to do things. He brought them into the fortress. He locked the doors. He made the changes internally, and he said, people, get on and hold on tight because we're going to go for a ride, and it's going to be dangerous, and it's going to be different, and it's not going to be something you're comfortable with. But if you want to be with IBM and you're ready for this fun change, let's do it. Throw out all the old ideas and let's open up our minds to something new. That's really hard because, again, as I said, people don't like change and they don't like to be changed. What you may find is you're going to have a huge amount of turnover and layoffs that are going to happen because you're going to sort of weed out the old guard that doesn't like the change and bring in people that are buying into the new change. So in that situation where you have to make some radical changes that are going to be really inconsistent with the way you've always done business and really inconsistent with your current culture, you really have to either change the strategy or tell people to strap on and be ready for a bumpy ride. But it can be done. And we have great examples of companies that have done that and have been incredibly successful after that point in time. Moving beyond corporate culture, it's also really important to recognize international or national culture. Each country has a unique culture to itself, and a unique way of seeing the world, a unique way that they perceive the role of women, the role of men, the role of authority, whether we're more collectivistic or individualistic, how oriented we are to particular time frames. Each national culture differs on these things, and as we do business and as we are working in a more of a global economy, we have to be aware that the people that we do business with, whether they're customers or future employees or suppliers, do business in a very different way, and these things will influence the kinds of decisions that we make. For example, individualistic versus collectivistic. The United States is considered one of the most individualistic cultures. It is not number one. Number two is Australia. And certainly if you think about American history and Australian history and some parallels and similarities they have, it makes sense. The rugged individual against the world, you know, can succeed. You know, and that's a myth because we all know that we don't exist as individuals without being dependent on others. Even those rugged individuals living on the frontier depended on each other for safety, support, food, water, friendship, in connection. And while we were more isolated, we still needed to depend on our neighbors and to depend on others for support. Certainly even the Pilgrims as they came here, you know, the old myth of, you know, working hand in hand with the Native Americans who were living here at the time for their own survival. We don't, live individually anymore and can't live individually anymore. But it's a great myth and it's a great story, which is one of the reasons why it tends to be the values that we, hold dear here in the United States. How important it is for the individual to be honored for their efforts. This is in contrast to a collectivistic cultures and sort of Asian cultures are more collectivistic, where it's always about the good of the group and not the good of the people, not the good of the individual. In fact, you might find that Asian cultures are much more focused on social justice, or they're more focused on virtue ethics, or maybe even utilitarianism, the greatest good for the greatest amount of people, as opposed to there's just one right way to do things and that's just all there is to it, because they're much more interested in what value comes to the group, not to the individual. So if you're trying to make decisions and you're an individualist and you're working with collectivists, you might encourage your people to make decisions along individualistic values, but they're more thinking about the collective and the whole and what's good for the whole. And so remember we talked in the first lecture about those differences between behavioral focused and conceptual focused and decisive leaders and directive leaders and analyzers. This is a great example of that. You have an individual who's got has a certain focus, but then the collectivistic person is much more like that behavioral person. They're interested in the group and making sure the process works well. So, national culture can influence someone's decision-making style very, very easily. Another dimension of Hofstede's dimensions of national culture would be power distance and our comfort with power distance. When it is a low, small power distance culture where it don't like differences in classes and power differences. Great Britain, for example, has a strong sense of social class, of the Lords versus the House of Commons, and the royalty and the Lords versus commoners, and there's clear differences there. I wouldn't say that it's a high issue at this point in time because royalty tends to be much more symbolic there than anything else, but nonetheless, these power distances are huge, and we see these power distances, for example, in the caste systems in India. And while they have been outlawed, per se, we still see that there are differences in different classes and what the expectations are around your behaviors and who you will marry and who you can socialize with. Here in the United States, we care very little for that. And we have our celebrities, right? Those are our royalty. But by and large, we like to believe that we are no better or worse or different than anybody else in authority, and that anybody can get ahead, that there's not anything inherent in a social class to get people ahead. I think fundamentally we believe that, whether or not it manifests itself in some of the economic issues that we see today with the distribution of wealth. That's a different issue. But the country as a whole has a lot of discomfort around differences in power and authority. We don't really like and honor that as well. But there are other cultures where those power differences are really huge. And so if I'm a kind of person who works with my subordinates to give them and empower them to make really good decisions, and for me not to tell them what to do, if I have subordinates that come from large power distance cultures, they're not going to feel as empowered to be able to make decisions. They may be more empowered to simply defer to what I want or what they think I want, and to not question my authority. And that could be a real problem when we have to make decisions in a crisis. Particularly when you see that there's a problem and you don't feel empowered to be able to tell me that I've made a mistake. And we recognize this has been a huge issue in all sorts of different cultures and all sorts of industries, particularly in the airline industry, when the second in command or the subordinates didn't feel like they could speak up, and they had to just go along for the ride, whether or not they liked it. So power distance affects decision-making, particularly in a crisis situation. The next two dimensions of Hofstede's definition of national culture comes around uncertainty avoidance and masculinity and femininity. The uncertainty avoidance is basically how comfortable we are with structure and order and rules. Do we like structure, or are we more favor weak, unstructured situations? Do we like uncertainty, or do we resist uncertainty? And there are some cultures that are very, very comfortable with uncertainty, and some that are really fearful of anything that's uncertain. And the more uncomfortable they are with uncertainty, the more challenges they're going to have making decisions in a crisis, making decisions when they don't have enough information. So again, to be really careful about who you put in charge, and recognize that if one of your subsidiaries is dealing with a crisis of some sort, if they are very strong in their need for structure and really explicit rules, they may be really unable to function when there is a crisis. And then we have to make sure we take that into account. Next, the idea of masculinity and femininity. Masculinity is much more about the tough values. They focus on success and money and jobs with very clear gender roles. Masculine cultures are like Japan and Australia and some Middle Eastern countries. And then feminine countries, feminine cultures, more about personal relationships and quality of life, and where there are less distinct gender roles. And the Scandinavian countries are very feminine. We know that men and women can both take very long paternity leaves, that people are guaranteed their jobs when they get back. There's no differences really in pay and expectations for people. Everybody is challenged to work hard, and everybody works hard. So that's the feminine side of things. And again, you can see if you are focused on money and assertiveness and competition from a masculine culture, a feminine culture And individuals from a feminine culture are going to resist that. They're going to be more focused on something very different. Their values will be very different. And that will be at odds when it comes to deciding which values should rule out, which path makes the most sense in terms of the outcomes from the decisions that we make. The next 4 slides are a really long laundry list of different types of national cultures and different ways of thinking about national culture. Hall has some ideas, Kluckhohn and Strodbeck have different ideas about national culture. And so what I want you to do is just review each of the next slides, take some time to absorb and read them. I'm not going to be testing you on, what harmony means versus subjugation, as you can see from this particular slide, but more I want you to really just have a good sense of how different national cultures, the different dimensions on which these national cultures are going to vary. Their relationship to nature, their time orientation, the way that they'll use words, high context versus low context. All of these are really important nuances, but I don't want to feel like I need to talk you through these. So take some time to read them and review them. As you get to each slide, click on play. It'll take you through to the next slide, and then we will begin again with the lecture material when we get to the components of organizational structure.